of being chair of the 2010-2011 Mitchell Lecture Committee. And I am so excited that this day is finally here. All this hard work, and now we can participate in a truly amazing event. As you can read about your programs and hear from later speakers, we are celebrating 2 historic occasions and making new history here with 3 amazing lecturers. This lecture series was endowed in 1950 by a gift from Lavinia A. Mitchell and memory of her husband, James McCormick Mitchell. We have had many notable speakers deliver marvelous lectures over the years and are delighted to be adding to this prestigious list this year. My job is to thank the folks behind the scenes and turn over introductions to our marvelous team. So let me just take a few minutes to tell you about the people who made today possible for you. First, Professor Fred Pineski, who served as de facto co-chair, coming up with the original idea of shepherding the process throughout, including up until late last night, early this morning, being on top of the details. And committee member Charles.
Thank you very much, Kim. And thank you all for coming to this 2010-2011 Mitchell Lecture series. I would like, first of all, to recognize the esteemed members of the judiciary who are here today. A large number of you have shown up to hear this lecture, and I want to thank you for coming to be with us today. So welcome. Let's give them a hand. I also like to welcome our students, our faculty, our staff, and our alumni who have come here today to listen to this lecture and to participate in it. So welcome one and all. The 2010-2011 edition of this lecture revisits a significant historical moment for UB Law and what I like to think of the undying quest for human rights. We celebrate today a major address by U.S. Supreme Court Justice Robert H. Jackson, given at the University at Buffalo exactly some 65 years ago. Justice Jackson had taken a leave of absence from the U.S. Supreme Court to serve as the chief prosecutor at the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg. That tribunal is commonly known as the Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunal. The tribunal, as you all know, was formed by the victorious Allies over the Axis powers after the defeat and surrender of the Nazis in the Second World War. Justice Jackson spoke at UB immediately after he returned home from that historic experience at Nuremberg. His speech, which resonates today, touched on a number of timeless themes, some of which we are reliving today. How a warlike spirit can overcome a nation. The quest for nations to work together cooperatively in the cause of peace. The interrelationships of war and dictatorship, and the supremacy of law over the lawless forces of war and persecution. However, as some of you may know, Justice Jackson had his detractors, none of whom was more important than his boss, Chief Justice Harlan Fisk's son, who attacked him, saying, and I quote, "So far as the Nuremberg trial is an attempt to justify the application of power of the victor to the vanquished, because the vanquished made aggressive war. I dislike extremely to see it dressed up with a false facade of legality. The best that can be said of it is that it is a political act of the victorious states, which may be morally right." He went on, "It would not disturb me greatly if that power were openly and frankly used to punish the German leaders for being a bad lot. But it disturbs me some to to have it dressed up in the habiliments of the common law and the constitutional safeguards to those charged with crime. Jackson is away conducting his high-grade lynching party in Nuremberg. I don't know why the Chief Justice used the word lynching, but there he did. I don't mind what he does to the Nazis, but I hate to see the pretense that he is running a court and proceeding according to common law. This is a legal too sanctimonious a fraud to meet my old-fashioned ideas. End of quote. Of course, Justice Jackson's view and his life's work will be vindicated some 70 years later in 2003 in the establishment of the International Criminal Court, a permanent war crimes tribunal to try the most heinous crimes known to man. I leave it up to panelists to arbitrate between Justice Jackson and his boss, Helen Fisk-Summer. This event today also marks a second anniversary as well, the 60th year of the Mitchell Lecture Series, whose first installment featured none other than Justice Jackson, speaking in 1951 on the subject of wartime security and liberty and the law. It's a rich subject that we're going to be hearing today from our panelists, and I hope that we all participate fully in it. Professor Carlin did thank the committee that organized and conceptualized this event and got all these wonderful speakers to join us. But I would like to add my own thanks to the committee and to Professor Carlin in particular for stewarding the committee in this direction. I recognize Eileen Fleischman, who is the maven, as she was called, of publicity and outreach, as you all know, those who are alumni. Terry McCormick, whiz for technology and logistics, and of course, Professors Mellish, Miller, Kanowski, who was so wonderful in helping out this year. I also wish to welcome and thank the distinguished guests, in addition to the judges who have joined us today. I welcome all of you. And I in particular want to mention the folks from the Jackson Center in Jamestown who have come here today. Now I would like to say a few words about our speakers, our distinguished panel of speakers. These three distinguished academics have traveled far to headline this event. I just want to say thank you for gracing us with your presence. Professor John Q. Barrett from St. John's University in New York City is a board member of the Jackson Center in Jamestown, New York. He will be addressing the topic of bringing Nuremberg home, Justice Jackson's path back to Buffalo, October 4th, 1946. Professor Barrett is an internationally renowned expert on Justice Jackson and is writing a biography of the justice. Professor Eric L. Muller from the University of North Carolina School of Law is a legal historian with a special interest in the Japanese internment cases during World War II. He will discuss the topic of Nazis, Americans, and the law as a peace profession. My good friend from California, although she's not there today, Professor Mary L. Disgett, the Judge Edward J. and Roy L. Dorado, Professor of Law, History, and Political Science at the University of Southern California. She's currently the John Hope Franklin Visiting Professor of American Legal History at Duke Law School. She will speak on the subject of rumors of war. It is exciting for us, for our students, our faculty, our staff, our legal community in Western New York, for a chance to explore these topics with you all, with these prominent visitors. May I ask you to stand and give them a standing rousing ovation. We shall have an opportunity to stand up and cheer again. No pressure here. Now let me turn over the microphone to my fellow professor, the director of the UB Law Human Rights Center, Mr. Tara Mellish, who will moderate the discussion. Thank you so much.
Director of the Buffalo Human Rights Center, it's my distinct honor and pleasure to be here to moderate this highly distinguished panel. As they've been introduced already by Dean Matua, we will proceed directly to the presentations. Professor Eric Muller will begin. I'm sorry, Professor Barrett will begin, and then Professor Muller and Professor Duziak. We will have time for questions at the end. These lectures will be, I promise you, they will be provocative and challenging to all of us, and I know we will have many questions and comments and thoughts at the end, and I encourage all of you to participate. Thank you very much.
Tech assist. It's up now. I want the full screen. Good afternoon. Let me begin by joining in the thank yous, because there are many here that are richly deserved. I begin with Dean Matua for the generous remarks and for the sponsorship institutionally and his leadership, Professors Kim Connolly, Alfred Konevsky, Tara Mellish, and their other colleagues and students who carry the Mitchell tradition forward in this lecture series and carry the great tradition of this law school forward. I'd like to thank James McCormick Mitchell and his descendants. His name is on this lecture, and the descendants include his law firm, Phillips Lytle, represented here today. And I wish to thank this great, formative city of Buffalo, which is a large part of what we're talking about. Particularly this great University of Buffalo, historically and today in the New York State University system, including this University at Buffalo School of Law. And my friends here in Buffalo and Erie County and Chautauqua County to the south, and much more widely, who are leaders in the work of the Robert H. Jackson Center. Also the bench, bar, teachers, and students at Buffalo have my thanks. I thank my friends Eric and Mary. They are both superb scholars. They're high on the list of best friends who you don't get to see very often in my life, and so this is a personal pleasure to have them here. Mary is a leading light in so many ways. If you're not a customer and a regular visitor to the Legal History blog, is one place to glimpse her work. Make that part of your habit. Her book that's coming out, I think we'll get a preview of this afternoon. Eric is many wonderful things, and in addition to all of his legal skills, he's a rock star, but that's a different story. And go to YouTube. I'd also like to thank the ghosts of some legal giants, Buffalo legal giants, who are here with us, or at least connected to our presence this afternoon. They include, and I wish I had time to do justice and explain who each of these is, Thomas Penny, Henry Killeen, John Lord O'Brien, David Diamond, James McCormick Mitchell, Judge Charles S. Desmond, Manly Fleischman, Daniel Kennefet, Dean Francis Shea, Professor and then Dean Louis Jaffe, Justice Philip Halpern, General William J. Donovan, Philip Wixer, and many, many others. Now, I don't wish to date anybody, but for people of a certain age, I've just recited the starting lineup in the legal all-star, not just Buffalo or Western New York, but I think profession of its era, and their echo connects to the Jackson story and what we're doing here. And I add one more name, singling him out because a very special place on this roster, which I will discuss, belongs to Justice and later Judge Charles Brown Sears, whose actions across 3 decades made possible so much of what brings us together this afternoon. We commemorate here the second of Buffalo's, Robert H. Jackson, 3 major lectures across one huge decade in the history of this country and the world, which he delivered here at the University of Buffalo. The last of those 3 Jackson UB lectures, widely known, was his May 9, 1951 inaugural Mitchell Lecture. And I think both Eric and Mary will be addressing that in their remarks. The first, the other bookend, on February 23, 1942, so coming up on an anniversary year, was then rookie Supreme Court Justice Robert H. Jackson's speech here at the University of Buffalo, Youth Faces the New Order, which he delivered at the 42nd annual mid-year convocation, commencement, in the Edmund Hayes Hall, part of the University Center at the time. Perhaps we will all be back here in February to commemorate the 70th anniversary of that compelling speech, in which Jackson, personally and intrinsically pacific and no warrior, speaks as a high official of a country newly at war, facing very candidly the uncertain and perhaps bleak prospects for the future in that winter of 1942. Between those bookends, 1942 and 1951, is the second of Jackson's University of Buffalo lectures. It is, of course, the Mitchell Lecture that occurred 65 years ago today, October 4, 1946. Jackson, who wrote all of his own speeches and judicial opinions and articles and letters and fishing trip reports and you name it, gave that speech no title. I think he did not need one. Who Jackson was and where he had come from immediately at that moment, the just completed Nuremberg trial, was obviously his topic. And it was part of what made his speech at that centennial convocation at the University of Buffalo so electrifying to its audience and so very significant in its time. Now, in this lecture, I will chart 3 paths as we consider Justice Jackson's path back to Buffalo. The first is Jackson's path to Nuremberg. The second is Jackson's 2 paths to Buffalo, one for the 1946 speech and one earlier. And the third is the general Jackson path that he discussed in that lecture, the path of law and education. And then I will have 3 concluding thoughts. Let me begin with Jackson's path to Nuremberg. It begins here. And out there. In a farmhouse on the banks of the Broken Straw Creek in Spring Creek, Pennsylvania. That's where he was born in 1892, in rural beauty and isolation. You see the New England architectural style. His forebears were Connecticut Yankees who come west and settled and cleared land and built log cabins and worked their way up to building this house. That's downtown Spring Creek on a busy afternoon, I think, in Jackson's boyhood. The hill in the background is called Eldred Hill. His mother's family was, his grandmother's family was a descendant of the Eldred chain. And one hill in that valley is Eldred Hill, and the other is called Jackson Hill. From that rural beginning, the family moved north across the New York state line, so we're heading towards Buffalo. His father was not cut out for farming. He was more of a wheeler-dealer, and he moved the family to Frewsburg, New York, a small town up the valley from Spring Creek and Warren, Pennsylvania. And Jackson attended modest schools in Frewsburg, graduating in 1909 as the valedictorian from the Frewsburg High School. That's Jackson as a 17-year-old valedictorian. Soon, after a year at the Jamestown High School, after an apprenticeship, after a year at the Albany Law School, without a year of college education, without a day of college education. Robert H. Jackson was a 21-year-old lawyer, hanging out a shingle, starting a solo practice, which became a two-man shop, which moved from non-paying clients to paying clients, and the arc went upward from there. This is Jackson in the early 20s as a member of the Chautauqua County Bar. This is Jackson that same year, looking a little smug on the left side of the photo, looking quite dapper, on vacation in the depths of winter in Puerto Rico, which tells you a bit about his economic trajectory. And this is Jackson a few years later. You can't pick him out of the crowd. You see it's the American Bar Association annual dinner meeting here in Buffalo in the Elwood Music Hall. Buffalo, the 10th largest city of the United States, was in this year the host of the ABA's annual meeting. And in the far, far back, I can't see them either, but I know from a seating chart on one of the tables you can't see is Robert Jackson and his wife Irene. And a year later, this is Jackson, again on the left side, maybe looking a little pensive because of all these overly dressed people, on his boat on Chautauqua Lake, which gives you another glimpse of his economic trajectory. Now that path is a legal profession path, and of course it's got some prosperity, which indicates some success built into it. But it also had a political dimension. Way back when he was just a year or two after that young high school valedictorian in 1909, when he was a law apprentice in 1911, Jackson's mentor, who was a Democratic committee man, a graduate of the University of Buffalo Law School named Frank Mott, took his boy Jackson with him to Albany and introduced him to lots of people, and I'm sure much political handshaking occurred. One of the handshakes was 18-year-old Jackson meeting 28-year-old freshman New York State Senator Frank Roosevelt. Neither one found the other particularly memorable. Jackson, of course, was just a boy from the boondocks. And Frank Roosevelt sure had a fancy name, but he was a feather duster, is what the Republicans believed. He embodied on the wrong branch of the Roosevelt family tree. That's what the initials stood for. And he was fancy and handsome and rich, but he wasn't going anyplace. And of course, in time, that Jackson trajectory up through the legal profession includes continuing involvement in Democratic politics, and that Frank Roosevelt becomes Franklin, conquers polio, becomes a governor, becomes a president, and as you notice, stands vigorously and grips that pole as if he barely needs it, with his protege Jackson, one person to his left. This is the early 1930s, 1935, a year into Jackson's service in the New Deal in Washington. He went to be the general counsel of the Revenue Bureau and the Treasury Department, today the IRS, Office of General Counsel. It was the biggest law office on earth. He was the chief counsel of the 200-lawyer shop, which dwarfed the Department of Justice, which dwarfed every private law firm in the United States. It was an administrative job, and Jackson had no patience for that. He liked to lawyer, and he wasn't that good at it. So he quickly sloughed it off on his deputy and began to litigate the nation's most high-profile cases, producing this and many other such indicia a year later. Magazine coverage and national headline roles. In Pittsburgh, during the spring of 1935, Jackson prosecuted the civil tax fraud case against Andrew W. Mellon, who had been the Secretary of Treasury under Harding and Coolidge, briefly Hoover, then the ambassador in London, and was either a monstrous tax cheat or a political persecution victim, depending on one's view of that case of the century. Well, the judges of the Tax Court of Appeals rendered a large judgment in Jackson's favor. He cleaned the clock of Andrew W. Mellon in the cross-examination, and Frank Hogan, the president of the American Bar Association, Mellon's lawyer, who famously said there's nothing better as a client than a wealthy man who's scared, probably was talking about that situation. And from there, Jackson went into New Deal constitutional defense work. This is the trio defending the constitutionality of the Public Utility Holding Company Act. Jim Landis on the left, and Jackson, the third fellow, has not remained as prominent. And that becomes the path to constitutional litigation in the Justice Department. By Roosevelt's appointment, Jackson's second nomination and senatorial confirmation is as an assistant attorney general. He first heads the tax division. Then he's transferred over to the antitrust division. Then Roosevelt appoints Jackson in 1938 Solicitor General of the United States, which is this beautiful desk and office. And it is a job to argue before these 9 justices. This is the court of 1937. You can see the turn has started to occur because the back row right is Justice Hugo L. Black, the first of Roosevelt's appointees. In other words, this is still the Court of Hughes in the center, and Brandeis to his left, and Cardozo in the back row right, and the four horsemen, but the path is changing. And Jackson, as Solicitor General, argues nearly 50 cases to this court in a 2-year period and wins most of them. Then, in 1940, he becomes Attorney General of the United States. It comes with a big conference room. Jackson found this unworkably large, so this posed photo is him at his secretary's desk, because he said, what would I do with the room so large? But this is the AG's conference room. And from there, the path might have gone even higher. This is a typical headline from early 1940. Roosevelt's choice for president is Bob Jackson. Because Frank, become Franklin, become 2-term President Roosevelt, at that point in time was at least playing coy, but I think probably sincerely contemplating observing the American tradition of retiring after 2 terms. He'd broken ground in his presidential library at Hyde Park a couple of years earlier. He had signed a contract to edit and write for a magazine. Something like Jefferson at Monticello was the idea of this Roosevelt in retirement at Hyde Park. And where would the Democrats then turn? Well, into the youth of the New Deal, into the next generation, and perhaps to this man as the standard bearer. World events, and then Roosevelt, and then voters, of course, had other ideas. And so Jackson's path led here. He's now the rookie in the back row right, appointed to the Supreme Court in 1941. And in this role, his writing, his voting includes participation in notable war cases, a category to think on, and we'll hear more about it later. They include ex parte query, in which he votes but does not write. They include West Virginia State Board of Education versus Barnett, in which he, of course, writes for the court, striking down the compulsory flag salute. They include Hirabayashi versus the United States, in which he votes as part of the court that unanimously upholds the curfew order imposed by the Army and the executive branch with criminal penalties on people of Japanese descent. And it includes Korematsu versus United States, in which he writes as one of the 3 dissenters from the court upholding the military exclusion orders for which Fred Korematsu was prosecuted for violating. That's a 4-year period in which Jackson is making a transition from advocacy and executive branch to judicial and independence. He's not extremely happy on the court. There are tensions with colleagues who he thinks don't have quite the proper model of the job, and he contemplates returning to things he loves: Western New York, law practice, etc. And again, events intervene. Franklin Roosevelt dies, and World War II in the European theater is won. And before the month of April is out, this new president of the United States reaches out to the man he personally regards, and I think it's fair to say the country generally regards, as America's finest lawyer. The request from Truman, accepted by Jackson, I think at the basic level of not so sure you like the Supreme Court anyway, and when your president asks, it's correct to say yes, is to be the chief of counsel of the United States for the prosecution of Nazi war criminals in the European theater. Focus on the date. It's late April 1945. The job coincides with the Supreme Court's summer recess. Jackson did his own writing and quickly, so his opinions were done for the term. They hadn't quite recessed, but it was coming, and then he would have some months off. And what he was told was, your country needs you to do this. There will be a stature that the United States contributes to an alliance project. There are cases ready to go. The evidence has been assembled. There are defendants who are about to be captured. And principally, this will be the trial of Adolf Hitler. Perhaps a few other co-defendants who will be captured with him imminently. Jackson says yes. He drafts and Truman signs an executive order. They both sign on the dotted line, and within days, this balloon pops in every way. There is no Allied agreement. There is no more Adolf Hitler. There is no assembled evidence. There is no legal plan how to do this. There is no prospect of doing it quickly, and Jackson is on the hook. So it turns out that he misses a full year in the life of the Supreme Court for the project that we call Nuremberg. That's the first path. Let me turn to the second path. 2 paths, really. Jackson's paths to Buffalo. It begins, in a sense, in the summer of 1946. And now I'm focusing on the path to the Mitchell, not the Mitchell lecture, to the centennial lecture that he gives a year hence. Over the summer of 1945, Jackson and Allied counterparts negotiate in London, and they work out the creation of the world's first international criminal court, the International Military Tribunal. This is Jackson signing the London Agreement on August 8, 1945. They then fly to Nuremberg. This is everybody but the Russians, who were not being permitted by Moscow to go quite yet, but eventually they showed up too. You notice the sexism of the time, and I want to note the theme that runs through my list of lawyers and this photograph and etc. was the reality of the man's world, which was the distorted and excluded world of Jackson's time. But one State Department lawyer is the woman in the skirt, one of Jackson's principal aides, Catherine Fike. And in Nuremberg they find this, a city that the Allies had bombed to smithereens in 1944 and 1945. That is the Adolf Hitler plots in front of the Frauenkirche, the church you see in the back right. This is another shot of that square. A couple of months after the surrender of the Allied occupation, it's been swept clean. But that's the reality of Nuremberg. And they also find this, which is a standing, although bomb damaged in one wing, courthouse. And behind it, as you see in the half wheel and spoke, it had an incredibly important additional feature, a surviving sizable prison. So looking at the front, you see the courthouse with a missing section. You see an adjunct building, and those top windows are the courtroom. And you see this cell block, which can accommodate a large number of prisoners, prospective defendants, material witnesses, etc. And there in Nuremberg, they soon fly 4 Allied flags on a formerly German courthouse. And they rehabilitate and commence a trial in this courtroom. They bring charges against 24 individuals plus 6 Nazi organizations. 24 becomes 22 due to 1 death and 1 determination of incompetency. And 1 of the 22 is being tried in absentia. So we're talking 21 real individuals in the dock. This is Jackson opening the trial. His opening statement on November 21, 1945 is one of the most spellbinding, permanently significant, eloquent speeches in English history. You see the bench to Jackson's right, the 8 judges, 2 from each of the Allied nations, a principal and an assistant, British, American, French, and Russian judge. And over the course of the next 8 months, Jackson and his staff for the United States and his counterparts in the Allied teams prosecute this case. The crimes are 4: conspiracy and substantive crimes of waging aggressive war, committing war crimes, and committing crimes against humanity, in the first international criminal trial ever. Jackson does extensive trial work. This is a photograph you see on the far left in the witness box, Hermann Goering, and on the far right, Jackson at the podium cross-examining him. He was one of 8 who Jackson cross-examined himself in the course of the trial. And by the summer of 1946, Jackson's part of this case against the individual defendants was done. This is Jackson summing up on July 26, 1945. From that point, Jackson is a spectator, and he briefly returns to the United States for August to prepare to return to the Supreme Court, where his work had accumulated, of course, during the missed year. And then he returns in late September for the judgment that the tribunal has been writing and will hand down. He didn't save his ticket stubs, unfortunately, so this is a British prosecution stub for the final judgment, which was returned, and you have to focus on the compressed dates here, on September 30 and October 1, 1946. On October 2, Jackson landed back in the United States. This is a photograph of him taken at National Airport. You can see the headline on the Washington Post, Goering, Ribbentrop, others, von Papen, 2 more freed, etc. You can see at the top that it was published on Friday, October 4, 1946. But by that point in time, Jackson wasn't even in Washington anymore. He was arriving in Buffalo. That's one of Jackson's paths to Buffalo. That's the through Nuremberg chief prosecutor arriving at UB to give the centennial lecture at the commencement on October 4th. Jackson's second path to Buffalo, an earlier path to Buffalo, the deep and life-defining path to Buffalo, began here. This is the county courthouse in Mayville, New York, located on the northern end of Chautauqua Lake. In this courthouse, young Jackson, a lawyer at age 21 in 1913, tried his first hundreds of cases. And by approximately 1916 or 17, in this courtroom, he appeared before a new New York State Supreme Court justice who was riding circuit and presiding in this courtroom, Charles B. Sears, a name, of course, of this institution. Charles Sears couldn't remember a couple of decades later how much actual trial work Jackson had done before him versus how much conversation on the margins of the trials Jackson had with him. What stuck in his memory was conversations outside of court, where this young man impressed him as extremely deep, extremely talented, extremely interesting. And the milieu that made that possible was something like, frankly, the 19th century boarding houses where the justices of the John Marshall Court drank their port and Madeira and conferred after hours. The lawyers of Chautauqua County at the inns of Mayville, down the road from this courthouse, judges and lawyers had those kinds of interactions. Well, for Charles Sears, that man made a mark, although he was quite young. And what Sears did was recruited to Buffalo. Now this is Jackson on the left. It's a little bit of a grainy picture, but he's the slip of a person next to his wife and his widowed mother and his 12-year-old sister. And he was the support and the livelihood for those three. Those were his dependents on which he petitioned and on which his draft board granted him an exemption from military service in the Great War, the World War that began in that spring of 1917. Jackson's world goes from this, which is fishing with Irene in the Broken Straw Creek, across the creek from the birthplace, and this, which is Irene sitting in his Jamestown office, a nice little cubbyhole desk, but obviously quite a modest operation, to this, the biggest office building on earth. Now, later, of course, Jackson headed the world's biggest law office, but at the time this building was built, it was the biggest office building on earth. It's the Elephant Square building. It's right downtown. It still stands in its majesty and glory. Because what Charles Sears did was told his friend Tom Penny, a great Buffalo lawyer, the Erie County District Attorney, the prosecutor of the assassin of President McKinley here in Buffalo in 1901, do I have the young trial lawyer for you? Penny headed a firm, Penny, Killeen, and Nye, office in this Ellicott Square building, which had a principal client, the International Railway Company, the streetcar company of Buffalo. And they offer Jackson a job, and he takes it. He goes to work, walking through this ornate lobby, taking the elevator up to the 8th floor. It's all still there, including the tile floor that he walked across many, many times. And I don't know if you ever remembered this, but when one walks through the Ellicott Square building today, knowing where the Jackson path went, this harmless 1917, 1918 geometric design does sort of jump out and cause one to pull out his camera. And Jackson and his young wife Irene, still no children, married just a year and a half, live here in Buffalo. This is Johnson Park on the west side in the historic district. This is the Lynn Haven building, built in 1901 as housing for the Pan American Exhibition, which of course attracted the president and then his assassin, and still standing today. It stands next to this white pillared building, which reputedly was the student home of Grover Cleveland when he was studying for the law in Buffalo in an earlier decade. It's a little pocket park. It's been cleaned up and rehabilitated, and behind the tree would be the building. You can see the doorway, and you can see the pillars of the Cleveland home to the left. And that's the Lynn Haven directly, 49 Johnson Park, the Buffalo home of Bob and Irene Jackson during 1917 to 1918. About a 6-7 block walk to the Ellicott Square building, past the City Hall, past today the McKinley Monument, and so forth. That was his world. And he's trying cases at a furious pace in the state courts, in the federal courts, in the appellate division, writing briefs, appealing adverse jury verdicts in basic tort judgment cases against the trolley company. After 2 years in Buffalo, things aligned to bring Jackson back to Jamestown. One thing that's happened is that influenza is piling bodies on the curbs of Buffalo. That's the fall of 1918. Another thing that's happened is that Irene Jackson is now pregnant with their first child, William, born the next July. A third thing that's happened is that the Corporation Council of Jamestown, appointed by the Republican mayor, has been drafted to Washington for a federal appointment, creating a vacancy, causing the mayor to reach out to the best young lawyer he knows to pull him back from Buffalo. And a fourth thing that's happened is that young Jackson, having made lots of connections and developed early experience in Buffalo, has that but believes he can emerge quicker from the slight remove of Jamestown. And so for all those reasons moves back there to establish his base in practice. And this is a photo that tangibly proves that he's right. This isn't Grover Cleveland's house. This is Bob Jackson's house in Jamestown, built a couple of years later with the proceeds of his successful practice. And then, of course, it leads to Nuremberg with the intervening events that I've talked about. While there, Jackson gets this cable, a little hard to read, but the last paragraph, this is Jackson's office in Washington cabling him in May of '46. Judge Sears, Buffalo, requests Justice Jackson as guest at Buffalo University, October 3 and 4, to receive honorary degree on occasion of 100th anniversary. Would like immediate confirmation of Jackson acceptance. And Jackson promptly cables back. Please notify Judge Sears of acceptance and appreciation of his offer, period. The date suggested immediately precedes the opening of full-term Supreme Court, which creates some possibility of interference. A nice, gentle phrase. I might stiff you, is what Jackson said. It would have to give court duty high priority, period. So far as I can see, however, I can be present. And then he's back in Nuremberg, and then the tribunal delays its announcement of its decision, and then he's leaving Nuremberg on the night of October 1 to be back in Washington on October 2, to get a night train on October 3, to be in Buffalo on October 4. He makes the trip. And for the rest of his life, what began in 1917 and continued across this period is embodied in the structure, continues to be a central part of Jackson. His deep, close, continuing ties to Buffalo, to its lawyers, to its bar, to its bench, to its great university. Now, path number 3. Jackson's path in law and education. His 1946 speech, please read it, it's in the pamphlet beautifully produced by E.B., describes his salvage from Nuremberg, which is humanity's salvage, which is civilization's salvage. I forgot to give you this. This is the Kleinhans Music Theater, and that is, of course, the stage from which Jackson delivered the speech, a majestic building to visit today. Jackson makes 8 points in the speech he delivers on this centennial occasion. At least 8 points. I want to pull out 8 and very quickly tick them off. This is him at the podium, and this, to give you a feel for him, is the first page of his reading copy. You can see that he wrote a text. I think he wrote it on airplanes. He certainly wrote it himself. And he then marked it up for reading with breath marks and emphasis points. And he stressed the following things. Number 1, the modern danger, threat, crime, security risks, etc., comes from the educated. Not little people, not obscure people. It's powerful, educated people who are the danger. Yet number 2, education, ironically or in a complementary fashion, remains our best hope. And number 3, Nuremberg as a topic of education is a new lesson in the realm of law. War, we now know, Nuremberg has established, is illegal in international law, as it has always been, Jackson says, in the moral order, and all individuals, even so-called statesmen, national leaders, heads of state, are now liable for this kind of lawbreaking. Number 4, international law, he emphasizes, also reaches the related evils, the evils connected to war, things like tyranny, dictatorship, violations of minority rights. And thus, for nations, for what he was leaving the international stage and returning to the United States physically, there are choices to be made. And he describes forks in the road. On the one hand, nations can systematize tyrannical power, as happened in Nazi Germany. or as he was observing as he worked in Nuremberg in 1945, 1946, as was happening across the Eastern European nations that were under the domination of Soviet communism. Or, alternatively, the choice could be made, as in the US legal system, to place constitutional limits on majority power. Jackson draws that connection from domestic back to international and says, this is part of what Nuremberg is sending me and us home with. And he says, number 6, that Nuremberg brings new higher standards, international standards, to guide the making of those national choices. We allies won on the battlefield and have now established in the courtroom the values and the higher orders, including protections for human rights, that hadn't been articulated with that kind of force and that kind of consensus before. That's another part of the education he brings home. Now, Jackson's speech, this is another page. You can see a little handwritten addendum on the side, which is about the IMT's conclusion that war was illegal. So in other words, it was typed before the judgment, and then he added in what the court had held, the October 1st part. And on the bottom, an addition about the death sentences. Statesmen are liable up to the level of risking their lives. I had to show you this because his day concludes with a dinner invitation. Mr. James McCormick Mitchell, our benefactor, invited Jackson to dinner that evening at the Saturn Club, a date I believe Jackson kept before catching the night train back to Washington. And the next day, of course, brought this to every newspaper in the country. This is the Buffalo Evening News. This is the New York Times. This is Vital Speeches of the Day a couple of weeks later. Jackson's message, the eloquent text you have, the 6 points I've itemized and 2 more I'm about to add, become part of the national conversation. The State Department propagates this through various media around the world because it's a message and he's a voice that states our perspective about what law is becoming. And the University of Buffalo gorgeously produces it in this book, which is the physical symbol of the centennial commemoration. So let me conclude. I want to conclude with a coincidence and then with Jackson's 2 final points. The coincidence is a little bit of a subtlety. It might be tucked into this letter. It's from Dave Diamond, a good close friend of Jackson's, Corporation Counsel of Buffalo, Jackson's friend for decades from Buffalo until the end of his life. Dear Bob, signed Dave, apologizing for not being at UB on October 4th. And he doesn't really explain why. This letter from Judge Charles Wazansky, a Jackson colleague in Washington and by 1946 a federal judge in Boston, explains explicitly the coincidence that is worth noting. He's telling Jackson that he's been invited to speak at a conference. Robert Taft, senator from Ohio, famously spoke at this conference the next night at Kenyon College. But Wazansky says he is unable to participate. I cannot deliver my paper at Kenyon College as the authorities had scheduled my talk for a Jewish holiday. October 4, 1946, unlike today, was a Friday. But this Friday, like that Friday, at sundown, becomes Kol Nidre, becomes the start of Yom Kippur. And I suspect Jackson in 1946 was oblivious to this, not Jewish. Dave Diamond Jewish, lots of Jackson's friends and colleagues, Jackson's Nuremberg Project in some dimensions Jewish. But I suspect the University of Buffalo, in scheduling its centennial, was quite aware of this and had made sure that this Thursday-Friday event didn't create a Jewish holiday problem for those who observe that faith. Now, the rest of Jackson's life is the Supreme Court. The rest of Jackson's life is Nuremberg. And the 2 last parts of his 46th speech that I want to point to as I leave you with this tableau of him and his smiling colleagues on the Supreme Court are the following. The first is Jackson's long view, this is point number 7 of his Nuremberg Project. I won't quote it because his words deserve your direct reading, but read the final paragraph in the pamphlet of Jackson's October 4, 1946 speech. It's about Nuremberg coming to have its meaning long after Jackson's time will have passed. And of course, here we are. And here we are at the University of Buffalo. Because point number 8 is a sentence tucked earlier in Jackson's speech, which I think also should jump out at you. UB is a site that, of course, he's speaking at, in the music hall at Kleinhans, but also as a center of learning and education that matters to Jackson. And this phrase reaches us 65 years later. The Nuremberg trial is not unlikely to influence legal thought in this institution's second century. And of course, here we are, which is a great honor. Thank you very much.